delirium, hallucinations, social withdrawal, disorganized behavior, genius, unruliness, and an extraordinary beauty. The character we will talk about now was the co-founder of one of the most famous bands of all time. I am talking about Kate. Roger Barrett, better known as Syd Barrett. The life and deeds of Syd Barrett continue to interest, or rather, I would say, to obsess millions of fans, both young and old. And all this has only further consecrated him to eternal legend. Several years after his passing, and his legacy lives on, we continue to dream to the harmonious notes of the legendary band he co-founded with Roger Waters, which is Pink Floyd. For those who don't know me, I am Linda, and this channel is called Morbid One, and here, every time, I talk about the life of a legendary figure in the world of music. Intro! The images of Syd Barrett coming out in a tank top, having gained weight. Going to buy a newspaper, we all remember them a bit, right? That man who didn't even collect his royalty payments, just think about it, was protected by a family unit that had remained his only reason for survival. For years, Syd Barrett was labeled as schizophrenic. Today, however, many specialists agree that he actually suffered from a particular form of Asperger's. Asperger's syndrome is a condition of the autism spectrum that is often accompanied by normality, but in Syd Barrett's case, it was exacerbated to the extreme due to his heavy substance use. All of this becomes even more significant if we connect it to the historical cultural context in which Syd lived, namely that of space rock and psychedelia, which also made him more vulnerable. But let's start from the beginning, as always. Roger Keith Barrett was born on January 6, 1946, in Cambridge to a distinguished middle-class family living at 60 Gleason Road. His father, Arthur Max Barrett, was a highly esteemed pathologist and was related to Elizabeth M. Barrett Anderson, who was a prominent doctor and surgeon living at the turn of the century, between the 1800s and 1900s. And Syd Barrett was just the latest part of this significant genetic line because his father, Max, was also a man of exceptional intelligence, possessing a wide range of diverse talents. He was one of England's leading experts in botany and mycology, an ornithologist, artist, athlete, and later became a highly esteemed, as he was described, pathologist. At the time, however, and we're talking about the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, no one knew that Max had Asperger's syndrome. Nevertheless, Max married Winifred Fleck-Hips, who was indeed Syd's mother, and Syd Barrett was the fourth of the couple's 5 children. From a young age, Syd showed signs of being a, so to speak, special child. Like his father, he was very inclined towards drawing, but he was also obsessed with word games. He was constantly searching for words that sounded the same but had completely different meanings. I find it very difficult to call Syd by his real name because during this period of his life he was still called Kate Roger, or rather by friends and family. He was Roger. His childhood was very beautiful. He grew up loved by his brothers, sisters, and family. And above all, he was adored by Rosemary, who was the youngest sister. Anyway, Syd was born in 1946, and only in 1960 did he approach music, specifically the guitar. Unfortunately, his father died very young at the age of 5, 52 years old due to a tumor. And although Syd was probably very saddened by it, he never showed his pain, at least not in the same way his siblings did. Let's get to why Syd was nicknamed that way by his friends. Among the many talents Syd had was comedy. He was excellent at doing impressions and enjoyed making people laugh. Classmates. Syd James was a comedian who was very popular in England at the time, and so Kate Roger was excellent at imitating him. And that's how We understand why he was called Syd Barrett, because he wanted to take on this name. Near Syd's house, there was a boy, a bit strange as well, and he was an extremely intelligent boy. I don't know what they put on that street. In that context, however, they must have sprinkled some magic dust. In short, because we'll see later. Later on, anyway, on the same street as Syd Barrett, there was this boy. A boy he referred to as my friend with the big teeth. You may have guessed that I'm talking about Roger Waters. Roger Waters, besides being a very intelligent boy, was also extremely traumatized by his father's death. In fact, his father, believe it or not, died in Anzio, Italy during the Second World War. Additionally, there was another boy on that street, not exactly on that street, but on an adjacent one, who was also very talented, and he was the most handsome of all, even more handsome than Syd, and that was David Gilmour. That's why I tell you guys what was happening in England during those years. But really, Syd, and Roger gave rise to their first little music group that I can't pronounce, so I'll read it. They were called Gay of Moth and the Mothos. Did I say it right? Help me out, write it in the comments. We reached 1964. Syd Barrett went to the capital and started following various music groups. Among them were musicians with whom he became friends. And he met his namesake, another musician who performed Beach Boys covers and was named Syd Barrett. But the name Syd was with an I. That's why he changed his name and wrote Syd with a Y. Another extraordinary thing about Syd Barrett is that he perceived sound as a form. Every sound, indeed, had a specific shape for him, or shapes that moved, that evolved. And it was precisely during that period that he began excessive use of cannabis, precisely because, and this is also a cultural factor, he was convinced that smoking opened his mind. Roger Waters asked Syd during that time to join IHAB of Sikara, the new group he had formed, but during that period Gilmour had distanced himself. He simply wasn't there at that time. In 1965, unfortunately, Syd began to experiment. In the realm of scientific and medical discussions, the term cyclopean doses refers to exceptionally large quantities or measurements, often denoted by the abbreviation LL. This terminology is crucial for professionals who deal with significant amounts in their research or clinical practices. Cyclopean doses imply a magnitude that surpasses standard levels, necessitating and consider that at the time the doses were even up to 250 times stronger than those currently available on the market. Anyway, in '65, still in that year, our guys met Mike Leonard, an eccentric gentleman who lived on the outskirts of London. And so what did he do? He brought the Habs to live with him so they could have the time to experiment and play all day long. He, in fact, firmly believed in the genius and power of this group, which was still in its early stages, or rather, not even that yet. Meanwhile, Bob Close, who was one of the guitarists of the Habs, was forced by his father to leave the group because his father was convinced that his son should work, do a normal job, a concrete job, and that group would never take him anywhere. Just think, both father and son, how much they must have regretted it for the rest of their lives. We come to my favorite part. Where does the name Pink Floyd come from? Yes, at the time he had an overwhelming passion, an obsession for everything that went beyond tangible reality. All of this was amplified by the things he was taking, and during that period he was very inspired in painting and was... Do I have to reuse that again? This word, he was obsessed with the color pink. Moreover, he was passionate about astrology, except that for Syd, the stars had the color pink, and he painted them that way. And so during that period, he kept repeating the word pink to himself. But that's not the only reason. In fact, Syd loved very much Pink Anderson, nicknamed indeed. And he was the author of Carolina Bluesman, Floyd, on the other hand, Van Dyke, comes from Floyd Kunsey, the author of Working Man Blues, which was also one of Syd's favorite pieces. And there we have uncovered the mystery. The band Pink Floyd is named this way for these reasons. Everything related to man's landing on the moon has inexorably influenced our music. Guys, I mean, almost everything comes from there. And psychedelia is everything that it came later, so we can also talk about 70s rock, and not just rock, but then all of this expanded everywhere. Just think of Kiss, Mark Bolan, and say, I'll mention one character, one for all our own in Italy, the early Renato Zero, whom we will talk about later. I want to dedicate an episode specifically to this, to how Mark Bolan's astronautic breakthrough has influenced and still influences today, even if we don't realize it. The album The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the first album by Pink Floyd, was the first album in the history of psychedelic rock. And this album brought Barrett's Asperger component to the peak of his artistic power. At the time, moreover, Roger Waters had the ability to know how to support and endure this component of Syd Barrett. Things would later change. Unfortunately later on, but at the time it was really like that. The Pink Floyd group now had an almost perfect composition. Waters, Mason, Wright, and the leader Roger, also known as Syd and Barrett. Syd was now fully launched into the world of music. He played and experimented all day long. Unfortunately, he fueled his mind with any type of substance or psychotropic drug. During those years, he had a relationship with Lindsay Corner, but he left her for two other girls, Jerry Spires and Carrie Ann. But his main goal wasn't women, it was reaching metaphysical knowledge. And through substances, he experimented on himself with every type of variation. Mental, interstellar. Overdrive completed the journey by going even further. Technically, it is the first module of space rock, as this trend will be called in the years to come. And it was reignited precisely by what the Pink Floyd would become once Syd was no longer there. Guys, from here on, we will slowly delve into the motivations that lead to this. They slowly led to social alienation. By 67, Syd is now dependent on any type of substance. The side effects of drugs begin to undermine his cerebral apparatus, dragging him towards that schizoid slippage, which will take full possession of his autistic inclination and will form the backbone of his new personality. The genetic predisposition to an artistic state of being, combined with everything we've discussed so far, reaches an artistic exaltation at the highest levels up to this phase. But this is just a flash in the pan. The downward trajectory is the consequence of everything we've talked about until now. Syd's brilliance was in capturing the aerospace frenzy and making it appealing to the music market. It was a very, very courageous move. For those who are passionate about Kubrick's filmography, it will be easy to spot all the similarities this has with the music of the Pink Floyd era. In fact, who really wants to understand the music of Pink Floyd? And everything that will happen in the following 2 decades must activate its activity during this period. Draw its information. Live at Pompeii, all the spectacular concerts, the sounds, the stage designs. Guys, it all starts here. It all starts with Syd Barrett. The band was now ready to record the second album, hoping that the success of the first could be a strong boost to gain more public approval. Syd spent sleepless nights, consuming more and more mandrax, drinking JMB, diving into trips into acid. This was followed by the tour. Imagine that with Jimi Hendrix and the Experience, although I should mention something, you might want to revisit my episode on Jimi Hendrix. He didn't leave much room for the bands. Indeed, Tick has been a supporting act for a long time. They were one of the many supporting bands that took turns on this tour. And Syd Barrett at that time could never have imagined that his definitive farewell to music was soon to come. He could never have imagined that his path would soon diverge from that of his friends. Roger Waters, on the other hand, could imagine it very well. He was completely exhausted, worn out, and unnerved by Syd Barrett's behavior. His fits of rage, each time more uncontrollable, were numerous and very frequent. Moreover, he had lost the ability to perform in front of an audience. He almost always forgot the pieces, couldn't start the songs, and his gaze had inexorably become absent. Imagine that likely for the recording of Hugh Ben Blues, Syd even insisted on changing the chorus. He replaced the backup singers with none other than the Salvation Army. Once he showed up to a television show in pajamas, after which he decided not to appear on TV anymore, just because John Lennon had also decided not to appear anymore. So he wanted to do the same thing. By the end of '67, things worsened inexorably. Often when he appeared in public, and especially on stage, he would mime playback and laugh hysterically. It was then that Lindsay, Syd Barrett's ex-girlfriend, told Roger Waters what had happened. After being at home shut in for 3 days, Syd Barrett, he brutally beat his ex-girlfriend because he saw a dragon instead of her face and tried to kill her. Then Roger Waters began to be truly desperate. He initially spoke with Alan Barrett, who was one of Syd Barrett's brothers, a doctor, and explained the situation to him, saying that he absolutely needed to be stopped and treated. In total good faith, Roger Waters even contacted one of the most popular psychiatrists at the time, a certain Dr. Lang. This psychiatrist, who was himself a heavy drinker, told Roger Waters that Syd Barrett would only overcome his problems if they let him be. Silence. Dr. Lang, who was often lying on the ground after 5 p.m. due to the effects of alcohol, obviously understood nothing about Syd's situation. This only made things worse because indeed Syd could not be treated. At the end of '67, he saw Roger Waters make a final decision, but with a heavy heart, guys. Don't think he did it from the heart, likely. And David Gilmour was already ready. On January 3rd, '68, David Gilmour officially joined Pink Floyd. The matter was formalized and also communicated to Syd Barrett, who initially did not react. In February '68, the group, now free from Syd Barrett, performed at the Imperial Bedroom. And it's incredible how Syd, who would forget places, circumstances, and didn't keep commitments, had come to know about the performance of his old friends. Imagine that he brought his Fender and tried to get on stage, but Roger Waters, with all the delicacy in the world, yet also with all the firmness in the world, made him step down, escorted him off. He tried, yes, in his own way, to rebuild bridges, to make amends, and requested a meeting with the group. And he did so, however, through the intercession of their manager, Jenner. Between March and April of '68, it seemed that Syd had slightly recovered. He was more focused. The manager was convinced. He knew that Syd was the true immense talent. And so the idea of a solo career for Syd Barrett was considered. After all, it seemed that simply stopping the use of lysergic acid was enough to bring Syd back to a better state. The problem was that even when Syd seemed to be doing well, he would suddenly do horrible things. Once he went as far as to extinguish cigarette butts on Lindsay's body, and unfortunately she was trapped in this toxic relationship. Lindsay would later recount that Syd Barrett spent most of his days staring at the wall, and he probably saw or believed there were things in the room. Once he decided it was time to punish his girlfriend and burned all her clothes. It was at that moment that Lindsay became aware and found the strength to leave, to escape, and Syd did not take this abandonment well at all. And so what did he do? He started using heroin. Without Pink Floyd, without Lindsay, the end of 1968 saw Syd Barrett living like a hermit. However, he went to live together, sharing an apartment with someone who would also become a very famous artist, namely Dougie Field. They went to live at Hills Court Square, which at the time was a little-known neighborhood that was continuously growing, and which is now one of the trendiest neighborhoods in London. Dougie would later recount that a great affection developed between the two, but that living together was still very difficult. And Syd, he slept all day while Dougie was very motivated and focused on himself, precisely because he wanted to build a career. Meanwhile, Syd was inexorably getting worse. During this period, he began to suffer from auditory hallucinations. At that time, however, Syd Barrett, still very handsome, was surrounded by girls who willingly offered themselves to him. He was in a relationship with Gayla Piton, but along with this Gayla, he also spent time with the beautiful Iggy Roger. During that period, the first lyrics for his solo album were born. Returning to Roger Waters, we must never think that this was an easy period for him. On the contrary, it was one of the worst of his life. And it was Barrett Schroden, who was a very young French director, who provided Pink Floyd with the lifeline to escape from that desperate crisis. In fact, the director had listened to the early tracks and appreciated Pink Floyd's Rumor style. And so he proposed to the quartet to create the soundtrack for his first film. This resulted in Soundtrack from the Fillmore, which managed to enter the UK top 10. Syd Barrett's first solo album turned out to be a true masterpiece, a masterpiece of psychedelic music. David Gilmour assisted in the production of the album. It seemed like everything was falling into place, so Pink Floyd were getting back on the right track. Syd Barrett had produced a masterpiece and had also gone full circle to find himself to detox. But unfortunately, Syd's second album, was a real flop. This was the truly great, devastating first failure that marked Syd definitively. Consider this: what might be painful for a normal person, if you'll allow me the term, was amplified 1,000 times in a personality like Syd's. Once, with his girlfriend Gayla Acid, he was at Harrods in London shopping and met Roger Waters. Imagine that in Roger Waters' face he saw a monster, a specter. He screamed in front of everyone in the center and dropped his shopping, fleeing in panic. And it was precisely following this incident that Syd Barrett's mother, who will play a role from here on, took her son home. To a neurologist, a real neurologist, a doctor with a capital D. Unfortunately, this doctor told the mother that there was nothing to be done, that Syd's brain was too compromised. A large part of the neurons had been eroded and nothing could be done to rebuild them. Of course, with the right medication and the right therapy, it was possible to mitigate his states of discomfort, his delusions, but this should not lead to thinking about 2 days complete. Absolutely not. In moments of clarity, Syd dreamed of changing his life, of becoming a doctor like his father, of having children, a family with his girlfriend Gayla, who was also very liked by Syd's mother. In fact, Gayla was a very sweet girl, and so Syd's mother, in a glimmer of hope, in 1970 organized a dinner with the parents, with Gayla's family, to talk about the upcoming wedding, imminent, of the young couple. The dinner seemed to be going well when at a certain point Syd stood up and, seized by an act of blind rage, he threw all the sauce on Gayla. She, the girl, looked at him horrified, and so did the parents. Syd ran to the bathroom, locked himself in, and shaved his hair, shaving half of his head. At that point, Gayla's parents, they dragged her away, and the girl, out of desperation, to also find the strength to get out of this now irreparable situation, moved to a small town 100 kilometers from London. Syd never accepted this. He tried to make amends, tried to call her, to track her down, but at that point the girl was resolute. You can imagine it was another relapse, devastating and final. After ending things with Gayla in such a terrible way, Syd Barrett shut himself in a basement. In '71, Syd's exit from fame was definitive. Nick Rock for Rolling Stone magazine. He managed to interview him purely by chance, and Syd told him that indeed Syd Barrett was dead. And from that moment on, he had returned to being Kate Roger. Syd, during that period, spent his days in the dark, shut in a closet. He had to erase from his memory everything that had happened before. And from '69 to '71, Pink Floyd established themselves as a crucial element of psychedelic rock. The long thread of Penelope that kept them connected to Syd found its peak in '71, its climax, with Stanley Kubrick's request to use Atom Heart Mother for the soundtrack of A Clockwork Orange. Roger Waters refused, while Michelangelo Antonioni relied on the band for the soundtrack of his film. But it was Mark Syd of the Mason who gave Pink Floyd an epic consecration. The members of Pink Floyd had now become rich, very rich, truly very rich. However, this did not stop the fact that an inexorable rift was occurring between David Gilmour and Roger Waters. But they still wanted to get closer to perfection, so while in '75 they were working on Wish You Were Here around 11 in the morning while they were in the recording studio, a man entered, a fat man without eyebrows. No one paid much attention to him. This man indeed had a large raincoat and a bag with toothpaste and a toothbrush. As soon as he entered, the first thing he did was go to the bathroom and brush his teeth repeatedly. Richard Wright didn't even recognize him and thought he was an official from Emmy. Everyone was shocked to realize with great difficulty that it was Syd Barrett, and David Gilmour barely managed to hold back his tears. None of that magnetic beauty remained in that glossy gaze, in that chubby face, in that gigantic belly. Syd ate with his former friends who gently asked him questions, but he was unable to respond directly and concretely. He indeed had a lost look in the air and spoke saying things, abstract things. At a certain point, it was time to return to recording, and Syd asked Roger when he would come in with his guitar. Roger unintentionally marked another negative notch in Syd's mind because he responded very firmly, "Syd, the guitar, it won't be here." Syd didn't say anything, but he probably felt something, an unimaginable pain. He went to the bathroom, brushed his teeth again, and disappeared, this time forever. From '75 to '82, there was no news of Syd Barrett, to the point that many people began to think he was dead. In reality, Syd was alive. He received his royalties punctually, but he gave absolutely no importance to money, and all his problems had amplified. He couldn't stand noises. He couldn't stand being touched. He stayed shut in the dark for hours. His mother and sister took care of all his needs. He was continuously monitored by his mother as if he were a small child. The silence was broken in '82 thanks to two French journalists, very brave, very bold, who, through a series of coincidences, managed to approach Syd and even enter his house. These journalists managed to find Syd Barrett's home address, and as luck would have it, coincidentally, the garden gate was open, and they entered with the excuse of having found Syd Barrett's shirts on the street, and they saw him in the distance. The mother, strangely, was turned away with her back to these journalists and was tending to cutting some roses, and Syd. That time he approached, and at that point the mother noticed their presence, but she let it happen while still monitoring. Syd had lost weight, but he had also aged a lot, appearing as a tired man, balding, always with that glassy look. However, the journalists managed to ask him some questions. They asked if he painted, and he said no. He also told them that he had undergone an operation without specifying, and he also mentioned that he couldn't go for the follow-up visit for this operation because there was a train strike, but he didn't know when this train strike would end. He was asked if he still played the guitar, and this question put him a bit in crisis, he said. No, I can't play anymore, I can't do it. The only thing he could do was watch TV. All day he started playing with the laundry that these journalists had brought him, and said he was starting to get very tired, that this thing, meaning that small interview, those few chats, were a source of fatigue for him, enormous, but he was very kind, thanked them, and at that point he got involved. The mother, who, with an excuse, called Syd, inviting her to have a cup of tea and greet her friends. Journalists. Unfortunately, from this point on, as her sister would recount, Syd slowly even lost the ability to recognize people, even those closest to her. She could no longer identify the features of faces. And it was the piece that Roger Waters dedicated to Syd. I'll quote a part of the lyrics for you. Hey, you standing in the aisles with aching feet and a fading smile, can you feel me? The protagonist speaks to himself and about himself, about his suffering in being in the public eye, in experiencing the discomfort of overexposure. But it is also yet another prayer that Roger addresses to his friend Syd. Would you help me carry my stone? Open your heart, I'm coming home. This is what Roger says to his friend Syd. At the time, Roger Waters was becoming increasingly depressed and hated the star system. The image of the wall as an interposition between human relationships strikes Roger's conscience as he analyzes the disharmony among people, their perpetual distance, and the impossibility of overcoming the obstacles that man himself creates on his path. And it is from here that the character of Pink is born, completely inspired by Roger Waters. However, I would like to talk about the discography and history of Pink Floyd in another episode. Anyway, The Wall is the final tribute that Roger pays to Syd. The pig algae, the pig that flies across the sky, the polystyrene wall that divides the audience from the band. And it is here that the definitive breakup of Pink Floyd occurs. But this, guys, I repeat, is another story. Syd, as already mentioned, suffered from auditory hallucinations for the rest of his life. He was never hospitalized, but he had to take antipsychotics and forever. His condition was nonetheless manageable and compatible with family care. One thing I didn't mention before was that Syd walked on his toes. He had a very peculiar gait that was identical to that of his father Max, and which experts attribute to Asperger's syndrome. This made him extremely fascinating. And consider that during his exile until his death, this gait became much more pronounced. In the accounts of his friends, another peculiar aspect of Syd's condition immediately emerges. In fact, he always had enormous difficulties, a lack of familiarity with everyday matters. He rarely changed his clothes and would wear the same pair of pants for even 2 months in a row. Moreover, he couldn't manage to do the most ordinary things. He almost burned down the entire house because he couldn't fry potatoes in a pan. Yet, even if he didn't know how to fry potatoes, guys, he was a factory of emotions. Perhaps Syd himself never understood how great his art was and how much his music contributed to changing the world, guys. Yes, to changing the world. Yes, because music determines emotions, and it is emotions that keep the world going. Syd Barrett lived in complete isolation. The following 35 years of his life secluded in his house in Cambridge. He passed away on July 7, 2007 due to pancreatic cancer, and he left in silence, in complete alienation and solitude. And he no longer remembered all the people he had loved and who had loved him. I remember that 2006 very well. I remember very well the moment when I received the news of Syd Barrett's death. Until that moment, however, people had never forgotten him. But after his death, his figure continued, or rather became even more obsessive for the fans, as I mentioned at the beginning, for both the younger fans and the older ones. What can I say, guys? We've reached the end. Also, of this episode, I finally managed to talk about Syd Barrett, and it was impossible for me to cover everything because every single note, every single painting, every word he wrote should be studied for hours. And I also thank Mario Campanella very much, the author of a beautiful book, this book here, that you can find on Amazon in Italian, which is a wonderful biography of Syd Barrett, in which the writer, who writes excellently, analyzes many things that other writers have left to the cats, so to speak. So I recommend it if you want to really immerse yourself in the psychology of Syd Barrett. That said, guys, I send you a hug, the usual embracing hug, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.